Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the session. We have had one or two small technical issues this morning. So first of all, congratulations from me on successfully making it through. My name's James, and I'll be chairing and moderating today's session. I'm the director of a strategic consultancy called Council, and we'll be joined by three other speakers today to cover the topic of global voices and global issues. A bit of housekeeping from me before we start. You all have the ability to put both your cameras and your microphones on, but I'm just going to ask you to resist that temptation for the moment until we get to Q&A, just to protect the bandwidth on the session. There is also a chat function as well, so should you wish to talk to each other, talk to everyone, or talk to me during the session, then please do that. And the most important housekeeping piece of all from me is please be honest, because today for us is the start of a conversation and the start of a process for co-producing a new sport and physical activity strategy for London. You're all here because of your expertise and your enthusiasm, so please do contribute and feel comfortable to do so. That said, just to let you know, the session is being recorded, and also there is sign language interpretation as well, should you need to make use of that. I'll start with some very brief introductory comments before handing over to Dr. J. Simon Rofe, our first speaker from SOAS at the University of London. And I always think in starting these conversations and starting the process of developing a strategy, the starting point has to be honesty. Being honest, I think there's huge potential across London and across the UK to have a better, more developed strategy around sport and physical activity, but we're not where we should be. In London, I think we punch well below our weight, both in terms of our physical activity rates across the capital. We see persistent, stubborn, and significant inequalities in the rates at which people participate. We know that there are several parts of London that have poor facilities. We don't make anywhere near enough use of active travel. And also we know that these challenges have been around for a long time, and there have been lots of conversations like this, but we've never really managed to actually crack it. So I think there's potential to do a lot better. I think also we need to try and get the attention of the UK government in a more meaningful way than we have. UK government's interest in sports diplomacy and sports strategy tends to be quite superficial. Sport and physical activity on one level is one of those things that most people like. So we have broad interests, but it tends to be quite shallow. We'll talk a bit about both Brexit and the COVID-19 pandemic as well, and the role that sport and physical activity might play in handling those processes and recovering from the COVID crisis. At that point, I'll hand over to Simon, who is going to start from some of the theory of sports diplomacy and some of his work at the University of London. We'll then also hear from Dr. Claire Jenkin and Gavin Price as well. And the good news or the bad news is you'll then come back to me to wrap up the session before we go into Q&A. So on that note, I'll hand over to Simon, and Simon is that amorphous green J that you can see in the middle of your screen, owing to the technical problems, but I'm sure we'll hear him loud and clear. And over to you, Simon.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, James, for that kind invitation, and thank you very much to colleagues, Chris Scott and everyone who's made today possible. Thank you so much. So what I want to do is take a few minutes of your time to really assess the question of where to start with sport diplomacy and why it's worth addressing. So two things here. One is, a piece of terminology, a phrase, sports diplomacy. It's something that has certainly become more in use over the course of the last 10 years. A legacy possibly of that event in the glorious summer of 2012 in East London. But certainly in academic and conceptual terms, it's something that's grown out of those experiences in 2012 amongst a group of scholars who've sought to apply the practice of diplomacy, an ancient phenomena, going back through the mists of time to the earliest human interactions. And the world of sport, which in some senses is equally ancient, when human beings have had the opportunity for leisure. Sport has always been part of that. Long histories of sport as a means of testing physical prowess, etc. But to move forward a couple of millennia, and certainly to the last decade or so, sport diplomacy is really the network of overlapping networks, the relationship between different polities, representation, communication, and negotiation are at the heart of sports diplomacy. They are the sort of three elements. And when those circles intersect, we see the practice of diplomacy, and then applied to the world of sport, we can see that play out. So in that sense, it very much offers the premise of a conceptual understanding of sport, the navigation skills, if you like, for practitioners to be able to see how sport can play on an international plane, but also on a subnational plane. So in terms of the city element, in terms of regional elements, we hear, not very far from our news feeds today about the importance of regional government. And so we need to think here about how sport plays out on a regional, local, and indeed sometimes even individual basis. One of the few privileges that the first edition of our national lockdown entitled us to was an hour of physical activity and sport. And so these were activities that really became, were put onto a pedestal almost, or a platform at least. And in that sense, understanding where sport sits in society allows us to then think about where it sits in terms of the broader international sphere, whether that's relations between states or relations between cities. And what sport diplomacy does in that sense is provide a sort of critical reflection for policymakers and practitioners, and occasionally scholars, to enhance their practice in these overlapping and conjoined spaces. In that sense, it provides a real opportunity to communicate with and have conversations that weren't being had before with stakeholders who were not part of a broader dialogue. And therefore, you end up with a wonderful melangerie of different actors, different polities, different stakeholders, different voices in the room. And it enables us to address issues that are particularly pertinent to today's society. So those of inclusion and diversity, wrestling with the gravitas of Black Lives Matter, women and LGBTQ plus representation in sports, the equality of those opportunities for young girls, particularly to engage in sports and to stay in sports. Now, all of these are features that will be familiar to this audience, I'm sure, and have been discussed in many other contexts. But the overlay, if you like, or the underpinning, depending upon which hemisphere you're sat in, actually enables us to talk about sport diplomacy in a way that hasn't been done previously. And that is really where the contribution can be made. And it won't be this is not as it were an academic pretense. It's not my good self and colleagues sat in those ivory towers that academics sometimes do, but because it has, in the words of Nelson Mandela, the power to change the world. And this has been manifest in the United Nations, that supreme, if you like, international nation-state organization in the Sustainable Development Goals. And certainly reading through the Sustainable Development Goals and the Kazan Action Plan, again, which I'm sure you're familiar with, which seeks to turn those from those 17 very short statements into practice around the world, and how you can take a Sustainable Development Goal and make it relevant to your individual existence. That's certainly something that sport diplomacy facilitates. And the Kazan Action Plan in that sense, and the work of UNESCO more broadly, is a really good example of that. But it's also important to recognise that having developed this field of practice and study, it's not something that we haven't crossed the Rubicon, we haven't cracked it, as it were. There's still plenty of work to be done. But it does speak to the symbiotic relationship between sport and diplomacy as the sort of first point to take away from this. The second is that there's a very much a two-way relationship, that the mutual influence between sport and diplomacy. There's also an important shared language and practice. We talk about getting over the line, the finishing straight in negotiations as well as in sport. And also, without understanding sport diplomacy, we're missing an opportunity, I would suggest, to talk to different communities, different stakeholders, and enable them to have the opportunity for their lives to be impacted. So in that sense, sport diplomacy provides a real opportunity for this sort of explanatory overlay to the network of evolving networks. There's an intersection of realms here, which makes it for a fascinating discussion, and I look forward to further thoughts and questions. Thanks, James.
Thank you very much, Simon. And from Greece to the University of Hertfordshire. Claire, if you wouldn't mind going next, please, and sharing some thoughts over the next 5 to 10 minutes. And I know you'll be thinking a bit about the practical application of some of those ideas as well in the way that we can develop policy and strategy moving forward.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, James, for that. Hi, everybody. My name is Claire, as James said. Just before I start, I thought I'll give a bit of a background about myself so you can see the kind of context I'm coming from. I am a senior lecturer in sports development at the University of Hertfordshire. In terms of my background, I used to work in sports development in London between 2008, 2012, a couple of different sort of boroughs in London. And I've just moved out of London earlier this year, so I am definitely a Londoner. I love the city and know it very well. In terms of what I'll discuss today, I'm kind of having a look at thinking outside the box, thinking about international perspectives to do with this. So I'll mainly be looking at doing a bit of a comparison with Melbourne in Australia, because there's a lot of similarities in terms of culture, but also in terms of sport. I lived in Melbourne for 5 years. I worked in sport in Melbourne. So yeah, I just wanted to share some of my thoughts using my knowledge and experience of both cities. To kind of start off with, I thought I'd provide a bit of a context and some background information about Melbourne before talking a bit about city branding and leverage, and then sort of finish off with community sport. So as I'm talking, just kind of think about stuff I'm saying and then think how it can compare to London and that kind of thing. In terms of Melbourne, for those of you who don't know, I will assume that the audience doesn't know anything at all. So if you do, I apologise, but I think that's the best way to sort of start off. Melbourne is a city that's very multicultural. There's been different waves of immigration from various parts of the world, particularly over the last 100 years. So very similarly to London, it does celebrate its multiculturalism. And also, as many Australians are of British and Irish descent, we do also have many other similar sort of cultural identities and cultural thoughts, which I'm sure many people on both sides are sometimes loath to admit, but that's true. So on a different note, but sort of similarly to London, Melbourne regularly hosts large events. So I think when we think about city branding and leveraging for sport, I think we kind of need to move away from mega events such as the Olympics and focus more on regular sort of large events. So, for example, Melbourne annually hosts the Tennis Australian Open, the Formula One Grand Prix, the Melbourne Cup for horse racing, the Australian League Grand Final. We don't really have an exact equivalent, but I think we could say it's similar enough to the FA Cup final in football, and also the Boxing Day Test in cricket. So they do host a fair amount of annual large events. But I think when you look at that, I think in terms of London, we can easily say we kind of do the same. We do regularly host a number of annual large events. They have the advantage that in most of their stadiums where most of these events take place are on one strip of road, whereas ours are more disparate, sort of they're spread out throughout the city. But the Melbourne Cup, which is horse racing, and also the Grand Prix are in the suburbs. So again, I think we can sort of counter that a bit. Final sort of similarity in terms of thinking about sort of city branding and leveraging through sport is there then a number of professional sport clubs. So if we take AFL, which is Australian rules football, it's a main sport. So I think we can compare it to football, which is obviously our main sport. 9 of the 18 AFL clubs are based in Melbourne itself. There's various kind of reasons for that, but it's not the place to explore it. Happy to talk to anyone if anyone's interested about that outside of this. But if we kind of look at it, in London, we've got 13 professional football clubs. So my point here is to say that each city has multiple professional sport clubs as well. So another similarity. So I would say in terms of that professional kind of sport, there are a lot of similarities. And when I went to any sort of conference or industry events over in Melbourne, they always sort of boasted about being the sporting capital of the world. It was always a key phrase they use, a kind of branding phrase that they use for their city. But I also think, with my very kind of London, England head on, think, well, hang on a minute, what about London? We have the similar kind of things, but we don't always brand ourselves in that kind of way. And even though this is about professional sport, I think it links quite sort of nicely to grassroots sport as well. How can we sort of brand ourselves and kind of, as James said earlier, just really sort of promote ourselves as a sort of sporting city. So if we also then sort of move on just to this kind of final part into grassroots sport, I think, as I said, in terms of city branding, we can look at the professional, but also bring in the grassroots and kind of do it as a collective. In terms of grassroots sport comparison between the two cities, unsurprisingly, due to our cultural similarities, over the past sort of 70 years, we've borrowed some ideas from them, and they've also borrowed some ideas from us as well in terms of different initiatives and different thoughts. In the last 10 years, it's been quite one-sided, with the Australians peering over to see what we've done. The current Australian-wide sport policy was released in 2018 by Sport Australia, where they followed our approach to look at encouraging physical activity more widely, rather than just a really sort of strict definition of sport. They've also similarly launched their current annual participation survey, which is similar to the Active Lives survey. If we look at Melbourne and sort of the state of Victoria, so that's the kind of regional area that Melbourne's in, they've gone one step further. For example, they've bought a franchise of the This Girl Can campaign from Sport England. So they've sort of more recently borrowed a lot from us. But I do feel there are things we can learn from them, and I wanted to pick out a couple of things. I know time is quite short. One of the things I wanted to pick up is something that James alluded to around active transport. I know in London we've made a number of inroads on this in the past few years, but it does feel, in my mind, as someone who's lived in both sort of cities, it feels much safer and more accessible to undertake this in Melbourne than London. So I think that's something we can look to learn. Linked to this is that Melbourne always scores really highly with regards to livability. Now, I know that the nice hot summers may have something to do with that, and that's something we can't control. But in terms of livability, is prominently mentioned in their regional sports plans. And I think it links sort of strongly to the more accessible active transport and more attractive incidental exercise opportunities. Now, I know in terms of to think about that, that's a very sort of long-term multi-sectorial approach. But I'm sure, as we all agree, that approach needs to be and is being embedded into all sport development strategies. So I think that's something we can look at. My final point, before I hand over to Gavin, relates to women in sport. Now, we do some great work in that area, but I also do think we can learn from some programs that are based in Melbourne. For example, there's a program called Change the Game, and also based at my old university in Melbourne, where I used to work. There's a group called the Australian Women in Sport Advisory Group. And what both of those kind of programs look to do is, beyond the active participation, to also cover sport employment. So be it in grassroots sport, they also do a lot in sport journalism, which I think we can sort of learn from, as well as officiating and administration. So just to sort of sum up, I know I've highlighted in this time a lot of similarities between the two different cities. There are also obviously a lot of differences and many complexities around looking to borrow or adopt ideas from Melbourne. So I do understand that. What I wanted to do today was just to kind of discuss different ideas to stimulate our thinking processes, and also to think outside the box and think that there are other places doing some really good ideas. So how can we learn from that to not sort of reinvent the wheel? So in terms of on an overall level, I think we can learn a lot from them in terms of city branding. And also from a grassroots sport perspective, they are implementing many UK-based ideas, but I do think there's also a number of areas where we can learn from them as well. So that's my just kind of my thinking in terms of looking over there. James, how about you, or should we go straight to Gavin?
Let's go straight to Gavin. Thank you very much, Claire.
Thanks, Claire. Really interesting to hear more about Melbourne. As somebody who was lucky enough to live there for more than a decade, I can certainly attest to everything that you're saying. One thing that really resonated was the multicultural nature of the city. I played a lot of local football in Melbourne, and each week you would play a team with a different cultural heritage. So one week it might be a Polish team, another a Serbian or an Italian team. So the cultural fabric of the city is one of its great strengths. And I think London also has that depth as well. It's one of the great megacities of the world, and there's certainly something in that around cultural relations and sport. Anyway, my name is Gavin Price. I'm an independent consultant who's interested in sports diplomacy at the sub-state and regional level. So what I mean about that, I'm talking about small nations like Wales, where I'm from, Scotland, Singapore, Croatia, or regions like Catalonia, the Basque Country, Bavaria, and indeed cities like London, and also boutique cities like Cardiff or Adelaide or Zurich and places like that. So in short, I'm interested in places that have a significant sporting footprint and heritage, and how those places can use that to better leverage their international engagement and cultural relations. So that might be around commerce, tourism, cultural relations, or building bridges between estranged parties for peace and reconciliation or social inclusion purposes. But today I just want to focus on one project that I've been deeply involved with, working with the British Council Wales. So that is working towards a sports diplomacy policy for Wales. So over about the last 18 months, I've been developing a research report in conjunction with a gentleman called Dr. Stuart Murray, who's at Bond University in Australia, where I'm also doing a sports diplomacy PhD on sports diplomacy. So we've been working with the British Council, and as part of that project, we undertook a long period of field work with many stakeholders. We basically consulted everybody across what we call the Welsh sportscape and government. So this included a broad church of people, everyone from sporting bodies to sporting clubs, athletes, grassroots sports, universities, business, civil society, and so on. Basically, anybody who was interested in sports diplomacy or using sport to project a better image of Wales on the international stage. Now, the key findings of that report are due out on the 11th of November. If anyone is interested, there will be an online open event. There will be a number of experts and a panel Q&A. You're all very welcome to attend. We're trying to keep it informal and engage with sport, so you'll find a couple of athletes there. For example, one of our most esteemed Olympians, Tanny Gray-Thompson, will be on the panel. We've also got the ex-Sky Sports commentator, Bryn Law, facilitating the event. So it'll be a nice informal sort of public sector event in conjunction with the British Council. The report covers a lot of ground, and we don't have time for that today, but what James and the team wanted me to focus on was how we might translate the research from policy into practice. How does the rubber hit the road? Now, because we haven't launched the report, that's not actually happened. However, there are a number of practical recommendations out there, and the Welsh Government is certainly taking them seriously in the background and considering how they might apply to their international strategy that they launched early in January 2020. So I'm just going to make 3 or 4 practical points about how you might translate research to practice. And I think this certainly would apply for London. If London as a mega city and an extremely diverse place with a lot of depth might be interested in doing sports diplomacy itself. So the first one is that it's really important to remember that sport is not a monolith. Obviously, it's very complex from the grassroots to the professional level. Indeed, the question of what sport is complex in itself. Do we include things like ballet, darts, even cheese rolling or rambling? In Wales, we have a quirky sport called coasteering, which brings a lot of tourists in. Basically, people don protective swimming gear and they jump off cliffs and climb cliffs and work their way around the coast as a way of seeing the beautiful coastline that Wales has. The interesting thing was that one of Wales's main USPs when we spoke to international stakeholders that we consulted was the fact that it's the only nation in the world that has a pathway around the whole coast, so it's completely joined up. You can walk your whole way around it now. For many countries, especially people in places like Australia where parts of the coastline are private and you can't walk around them, that's kind of mind-blowing that you can just walk your way around the whole coast. It's a fantastic selling point. It brings people together, it's inclusive. In relation to London, it's such a big city, it's going to have many USPs like that it needs to think about and sell. So it needs to think about what are its true sporting assets, from maybe Premier League football or top level rugby union, down to quirky sports activities and niche sports activities, and obviously pulling on its diversity and depth. Secondly, it's really important to think about your stakeholder base. As I've just mentioned earlier, sport is very diverse. We need to be speaking to everybody across the piece. So in Wales, we really made sure that everybody was welcome, all voices were welcome, and some of the greatest ideas came from people in the general public or people in some of the smaller sports activities or niche sport activities. So, for example, Wales now has one of the largest Ironman events in the Northern Hemisphere down in Tenby called Ironman Wales. It's such a fantastic platform, it's multinational, we get many international competitors. Is Wales truly leveraging off that event like it should? Well, it's getting there, it's doing a lot with the Welsh Government in terms of marketing, but there's so many more things that we can do. So just think about the depth and diversity of sport across London. Thirdly, we need to be mindful that many clubs and sports, particularly top-level sport, already have vast international footprints and networks. So if you think of somebody like Spurs Football Club or Arsenal, or maybe one of the top rugby clubs like Wasps or Harlequins, they already have significant networks. They're dealing with multinational stakeholders at the governing body level. So UEFA, FIFA or World Rugby. They're also regularly paying in European and international competition, building bridges with administrators, fans, media, and so on. So to some extent, if government or local government is looking at doing sports diplomacy, you're already tapping into networks. I think that you also need to think about that, well, sport is going to be thinking, well, what's in it for sport? It's not just about government. So I think government and local government needs to think really carefully about what's in it for sport. You're going to be leveraging off their networks that are already in place. Fourthly, there's plenty of research out there that shows that sport is arguably the UK's #1 soft power asset. The British Council does a lot of work in this space. In Wales in particular, we have the British Council 2018 Wales Barometer report that benchmarked Wales against a number of other small nations and regions around the world. So places like Hokkaido in Japan, Catalonia in Spain, Scotland, and a number of others on soft power variables. So everything from culture to language to music to food and sport. Now, sport did come out as Wales's #1 soft power asset. In fact, it was second in that list and only polled just behind Catalonia, and obviously that's down to the Barcelona Football Club and sports precinct effect. So that's quite a big deal for a small nation like Wales that has 3 or 4 million people to have that asset and clout when it comes to sport. So I think that when you pull all this together, sport is certainly something that could potentially help London when it thinks about recovery and generation from COVID-19, and certainly presenting a positive image of itself post-Brexit. And I also think it can be, and it already is, the glue that can bring communities together and should not be underestimated. So just to wrap up, because I'm sure there are plenty of questions. In conclusion, 4 things. Map your assets. Remember, sport is really diverse. There are different levels, different types of sport, even those that you don't always think about. Make sure you think about the diversity of your stakeholder base and make sure you involve them in the conversation from A to Z. Thirdly, consult and always be inclusive. In fact, what we're doing in Wales is using the consultation base as a team that will look at the terms of reference to develop and implement potentially a sports diplomacy policy in Wales. So those people we spoke to will be intrinsic to moving towards policy moving forward for Wales. Fourthly, it's certainly a shared responsibility. Nobody owns sport. Sport is for the people. So I think, that's, I guess, just reinforcing my inclusivity message. I think that's pretty much it, James. I might hand over to you and any questions.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Gavin. And we've already got some great questions here, so please keep those coming. Just a couple of observations from me, and a couple of responses to things that the panel have said. I mean, first of all, I'm afraid a bit more pessimistic about where the status of sport and physical activity is, certainly at a UK government level. I think Simon is right that we saw a lot of really positive language around why it was important, certainly during the first stage of lockdown. But what we've seen since then is the continuance of some pretty warm words that, being very frank, government's always been good at when it comes to sport strategy, and very little action. I think if you can see where both sporting events, but more pressingly for me, community physical activity facilities are in terms of the reopening priority compared to other sectors, I'm not convinced that government centrally is taking it all that seriously. I think we've got a real challenge in terms of the relationship between City Hall and Westminster, for a number of obvious political reasons, but also because the philosophy of this government simply isn't clear yet. It's been entirely devoted to Brexit and then COVID, the latter in particular for very understandable reasons. So we don't really know what motivates government at this stage, and that of course makes that intra-UK influencing pretty difficult. A couple of other points too. The phrase world leading is thrown around a lot at the moment, and we can take a view on whether the systems we have here are world leading or not. But certainly I think London can be a world leading sports city. For me, that has to be motivated by three things. First of all, bringing the best of the world's talent here and showcasing it in elite and professional sport. I think that's a great thing in itself, and it's a great economic driver for activity in the capital as well. The second is genuinely taking seriously and tackling inequity and inequalities in the current system, making sure that opportunities are far more available for Londoners who don't look like me, so people who are not white, male, and middle class, making sure that we are actually responding to what people want. But thirdly, I think we should be setting the ambition to be the world leader in integrity, ethics, and sports governance. I think we should have duty of care for all of our participants, our volunteers, our staff, and our athletes at the heart of everything we do. I think we need to take the mental health of everyone within the system and touched by the system far more seriously than we do at the moment. Just before I kind of introduce some of these questions as well, I'll just come back very quickly on some of them. So the first is a question about whether diplomacy can be taught, and I'm going to ask Simon to answer that one because I think that's his job. But there's a second point here about partnership working within the physical activity and sports sector. I still think partnership working within the whole breadth of the sector is quite poor, and it's immature. I think we see efforts at this occasionally, generally in the response to, for example, a crisis at the moment, but the ability of the sector to build coalitions and operate in partnership is limited, and the ability of sport in the broadest sense to influence other sectors as opposed to the arts, for example, is very different. We're nowhere near where other sectors are in terms of their ability to influence other sectors. But Simon, if I may, just on the very specific question about whether diplomacy can be taught, what would be your answer to that one?
As you suggest, it is my job. So if I said no, I might put
myself. We might as well now,
yeah. I would agree that diplomacy can be taught, but I would take the sort of premise of the question that there are some qualities to diplomacy that are, take longer to learn, certainly, and perhaps some of the pre-existing qualities of certain features of education have led themselves to that thinking in the past. Certainly, there was a case within the British Foreign Service for best part of a century, up until the 1990s, that it really didn't matter what qualifications you had, as long as you passed the entrance sort of exam, we could teach you to be a diplomat. You would learn on the job. In fact, it was preferable to learn on the job, because you didn't come with preconceived ideas of what you might want to do. So I would suggest that, perhaps did a disservice to a number of individuals, certainly different communities, and it meant that you had a lot of diplomats in the UK Foreign Service who looked like their predecessors. It wasn't until the 1950s that women were allowed to work in the Foreign Service, and until the 1970s, women who were married had to leave the service. So these are, really only a generation or two ago, as an example of some of the sort of difficulties and challenges in terms of being a diplomat and being taught diplomacy. I would say subsequently, and certainly in the last decade, the Foreign, Commonwealth and now Development Office have made great strides in inclusivity aspects, and have really sought to educate their staff, and particularly to bring in colleagues with other experiences. So not people, as it were, straight out of university are going to devote 40 years of their lives to the British Foreign Service, but people who have had other experiences. So I would say that diplomacy can be taught. There are different cultural variations clearly around the world, and that's where I think the concept of global diplomacy is really significant, and why you need to have an understanding of the sort of core activities of negotiation, representation and communication, and where those three aspects come into play, whether they are taught in a classroom, in a class of diplomacy, or whether they are learned in a business environment, in a schooling education setting, or indeed on the football field or the cricket field. I think all three of those aspects can come together, and that's where an understanding of diplomatic practice, whether you have the pomp and circumstance of national level diplomacy, but that's certainly where diplomacy is in play.
Thank you very much. That's a great answer. There's a very specific question here directed at Claire, and it's about Melbourne. And the question is, does Melbourne have any good ways of encouraging trickle down from elite sports and events down to the grassroots, for example, in finance and participation?
I mean, in terms of participation, first, I think in terms of most of the research shows that the trickle-down effect, this is across the world. There's very limited research to suggest that elite sport events actually have any sort of impact on grassroots participation. There can be some sort of trickle down in that respect to those who already play sport, but in terms of most of the research shows that it doesn't have any impact on the majority of the population. So that's sort of international. So Melbourne would be the same as London or anywhere else in that respect. In terms of to boost finance, from my understanding, the tourism kind of aspects of Melbourne do sort of heavily sort of market the sporting events. There's a lot of work between the sporting events and sort of local government in terms of tourism, but all kind of visit Melbourne, all that kind of thing. So I don't know in terms of actual stats to do with that, but I know there is very close kind of working there. So I think in terms of my answer would be yes, I think it does, but I don't know the exact stats.
Thank you, Claire. You've frozen, but I think you'd almost finished. I think on the point about the kind of trickle-down economics theory within sports really interesting, because Claire's absolutely right. The actual evidence for the theory behind you host an event and immediately your population becomes more active is very, very limited. In fact, it doesn't really exist at all. And yet that is still the principle on which a lot of sports strategy is predicated. And certainly the argument for hosting major events and mega events is very heavily predicated on that idea. And where we've most prominently seen that go wrong is in the case of London 2012, where I think it was a fantastically successful event in all kinds of ways and has left a very positive legacy in a number of ways, but not a legacy of increased participation by default. And that's the way that it was sold to people. And I think that was a real mistake. So I suspect that the Melbourne experience is very similar to here in that respect. Gavin, a question for you. And the question is that our sector talks frequently about wanting to learn from others and sharing our own learning, but we rarely seem to follow through on those intentions. Is that similar in other countries? And is there anywhere we should be looking more broadly in terms of knowledge exchange? So do any other countries do this particularly well? And in your experience of working across multiple territories, is there somewhere else that we should be looking at and seeking their experience and their advice?
Thanks, James. That's quite a wide-ranging question, and my answer is, to some extent, it depends, and that's not a cop-out, but it depends on what are your goals. What are you trying to do through sports diplomacy? Is it high-level, more formal stuff, for example, like trying to increase the number of seats that you have on a world sport governing body, therefore shining a light on your nation or region on an international stage, or are you looking to build bridges between estranged communities? Are you looking to do maybe sports for development and peace in a recovering war zone or something like that? So it's kind of horses for courses. To my knowledge and what I've been involved with, certainly most players that are sort of semi-serious about sports diplomacy are interested in what's happened in different jurisdictions and different nations and regions. They're looking at best practice. So, for example, the EU level, the supranational level, has a grassroots sports diplomacy team, and they've spent a lot of time looking around the world at what's going on. For example, they looked at sports for reconciliation and peace programs in the Balkans, connected to the refugee crisis. If you think about major nation states like the United States, the Department of State there has a long-standing sports diplomacy program. They do things like send athletes ambassadors to different nations to help build. Maybe they'll send an ex-professional football player or baseball player to coach kids or develop coaches in other nations and therefore build bridges. They also have a development program where they look at women around the world who are interested in learning diplomatic and sports diplomacy skills, and they'll bring them to the States and coach them in programs around sports diplomacy. And the idea is they'll go back to their nations and implement sports diplomacy and just help build infrastructure and know-how back in their home countries. Certainly, in relation to Wales, the work I've done there, the British Council, Wales and Welsh Government were very keen to learn from different places. So the report, as I said, will be out on the 11th of November, and you'll see it broken down into different levels. So we've looked at a small nation like New Zealand, the kind of things they're doing. They've done really well in the sort of nation branding space around adventure and activity sports. As you know, you will have seen a lot of the tourism marketing. But also, if you think about it, rugby union is still quite a niche sport in the world. There are only a number of countries that really take it seriously at the very top level. Yet the All Blacks jersey and the haka is probably one of the most iconic symbols in world sport. So they're using that to leverage their profile and probably punching above their weight. Is that something that Wales might learn from? But then, as I mentioned earlier, Wales is learning off places like Australia, who has arguably the first freestanding holistic policy on sports diplomacy. It's called Sports Diplomacy 2030, if you want to look for it. Claire mentioned it earlier. We're looking at some of the stuff Japan has done, United States, and a raft of other nations. So yeah, the short answer is, I do think most people in the space are interested in case studies and other examples, but obviously each nation or region or city is different. They all have unique attributes and USPs. They need to think about what they are, then try to leverage off them. So I don't know if that answers the question, James.
I think so. I mean, I think my experience of drawing comparisons with other nation states in this kind of area is very limited, but many people in this meeting will have heard me say this many times, but I make no apology for that because I think it's right. If you look at the comparison between sport and physical activity sector in the UK and the arts sector, I think the comparison is relevant and pertinent and also a bit uncomfortable to those of us on the sports side of that equation. The arts sector has been historically and currently far more effective in, first of all, speaking with a united voice and having a clarity of purpose. Secondly, having a very clear sense of solidarity between those at the top and everyone else. So the kind of rescue packages and other things that are being put in at the moment, very clearly the organizations at the top will demonstrate how they will help and support the rest of the pyramid. And also, there are huge disagreements and disputes and arguments within that sector, but for whatever reason, those are dealt with in a more subtle and private way than they tend to be within our sector, in inverted commas, for whatever reason. And it leads me to a question from Lorna. And I think the short answer to this question, Lorna, is yes, but I will bring the panel in. The question is, are we seeing the impact of not convincingly and unitedly proving the benefit of sport and physical activity to the economy, health and society? And has that played out essentially in government's lack of financial support directly into the sector? My short answer to that is unfortunately yes. I think we are seeing the impact of that. Having been around this kind of area for the last 7 or 8 years, but working in other industries previously, I'm still struck by, first of all, the lack of unity, even in making quite basic points, but also the lack of data and evidence that we have at our disposal as well. So very frequently, people in central government will ask, and asked me frequently in my previous job, how many people does the sector employ? And we couldn't really answer that. How many clubs are there? We couldn't really answer that. And then when they said, what do you actually mean by sport? Well, we couldn't really answer that either without having a bit of an argument about it. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a lot of amazing practice out there, because there absolutely is. But until we get better at communicating with that unified voice and having that quality and depth of evidence, I think we're always going to be behind in what is a competitive process where everyone is after that money and after that support. And as the three other panelists are far more academically qualified than I am, I will bring them in as well, just to comment on that. Perhaps Claire and then Gavin and then Simon in that order, if I could, just on that point around unity of voice and evidence as well. Claire, I think you might be on mute. Okay, right. Hospital pastime. Gavin, you go first.
So the question is around the unity of voice and evidence in terms of unity around wanting to do sports diplomacy. Is that the question in terms of a diverse stakeholder base, or have I misunderstood you, James? Sorry.
I think it's Lorna. Please come in and correct me if I'm wrong about this. I think this is more about the UK context and where this sector sits in the relative pecking order and the priority that government's attaching to it. And I guess my bit of context as well is that I don't think any other sector does as much as we do in terms of improving health, well-being and community cohesion. But in spite of that, we seem to be pretty low down the list in terms of priorities.
Sure, that's a really good question, and it's certainly something that I've experienced, but we're trying to change in Wales, but also at the UK level. So neither Wales nor the UK has a sports diplomacy strategy, which for me is mind blowing, because it clearly is our number one soft power asset, as we mentioned earlier. There's plenty of evidence around that. You don't have to go far in the world, for example, to find a fan of a Premier League club, for example. You have to switch on the TV and you're probably going to find a game in any time zone in the world. But one of the problems is that, and you mentioned culture earlier, is kind of, who owns this space? Often we hear some diplomats saying, well, we don't do sport. And, and my answer, and certainly Dr. Stuart Murray, who I work with from Bond University, his answer would be, what will you do now? Diplomacy is diversifying. There are many types of diplomacy. I always think, I always note an example. I was working for the UK government in international trade up until around about 2 years ago. And I was at a trade delegation in the Ukraine. And during one of the breaks, I started talking to the Ukrainian trade minister about Dynamo Kiev Football Club. Now, the head of the delegation from the Foreign Commonwealth Office looked at me, gave me an incredulous look at the time, saying you shouldn't be, talking to the trade minister about this. There are protocols. But in actual fact, what happened was his face lit up, and we ended up speaking for about 20 minutes. But by virtue of doing that, we also started talking about the difficult issue in the trade negotiations, because we'd broken the ice, and we actually resolved that issue on the day. And later that day, he arranged for somebody from the ministry there to take us on a little tour of the stadium. So that's just a sort of practical example. So there are a few things there. I think the idea that sport isn't part of culture is ludicrous. I know there were some people in the British Council uncomfortable about that, because there are, I guess, some tensions around funding streams for other parts of culture. My view on that is they are inherently interlinked. If you think about a major sporting event, something like the Homeless World Cup that we had down in Cardiff last year, around that event there were seminars, there was poetry, there were music events, there was dance, theatre, all connected to the same event. So they're inherently interlinked. And sport is culture for me. It's a key part of British culture, Welsh culture, Scottish, English, and so on. So it's about having that dialogue with different levels of government, getting them to think about it a bit more widely, a bit more smartly, and then talking about how we can synergize with other parts of culture, and then building on that. And when you get to that point, then there are many opportunities that arise, and many different platforms. A good example, we're considering maybe in Wales trying to partner with one of Wales's key trading partners in the Basque Country, Flanders, places like that, around a youth football tournament. And then on the back of that, there may be cultural and language events to help build the profile of the respective areas and nations. So probably gone off piste a little bit there, but it's a kind of complex question, and sorry if I've not answered it directly.
No, that's fine. And just another little bit of housekeeping from me with 5 minutes to go. Just to remind you to please join sessions on the main stage. Immediately after this, there's a session at 9 a.m. called London 2030, which is looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on sport in Stockholm, Singapore, and London. And at 11 a.m. also on the main stage, there's a session on digital sport and the role of the digital sector in promoting future participation.
James, do you want to just come back in there?
Yes, please.
So a couple of things here. I think James's experience working with the UK government, and perhaps his slight frustration that sport hasn't been taken seriously, can be borne out over the course of the last generation. But I would give some reasons for hope in this last couple of minutes. Over the course of the last 6-9 months, there have been some proactive engagement on behalf of both DCMS, DFID as was, FCDO as is, with the opportunity to use sport as part of, and again, however we might like or dislike the phrase, a global Britain and a post-Brexit Britain. And whatever the circumstances that have seen us arrive here, there is a recognition, an increasingly welcoming opportunity for sport to be part of what Britain stands for. Now, again, that's another conversation, but one of the things that's been manifest in that is the inclusion, and indeed the first element of the British soft power strategy. And again, that title, is a working one, so don't hold me to it. But looking at the way that Britain interacts with the world, and sport is the first element that has been developed in that regard. So it is, part of a discourse in which the UK is looking to understand and think about the way it is seen within the world and the assets it has and the ways that can be done moving forward. I think it does mean that there are still numerous challenges out there for sport as a whole, but it is a conversation and a dialogue within government and with the opportunity for working groups amongst sporting groups that I think is certainly a feature that I've seen emerge over the course of the last 10 years or so, and I think that is a recognition of the understanding and the diversity of thinking within our aspects of government that puts sport on a different pedestal.
Thank you very much, and it's great to come towards the conclusion with that positive note. And I completely agree that in terms of export value, both in hard economic value and soft power as well, there are tremendous assets within the sporting sector in this country. And for whatever reason we're here, the ability to actually leverage that better is tremendously exciting. We've got 3 minutes to go, and apologies to those who've submitted questions we haven't had a chance to get to. As I said, this is the start of a conversation, and we will be back in touch about how we can actually start to crystallise some of this and work together to co-produce a new strategy for London. With that in mind, I am just going to give the last word to our 3 panellists, and I'm going to ask you to share one thing that if we were working with a blank sheet of paper this morning with City Hall and Westminster to start to write this strategy, what would be that one thing that you really want to get in there? So what's the absolute top priority for London's future sports strategy? And again, I'll come to Claire first and then Gavin, and give the last word to Simon. Thank you. Claire doesn't want a last word, that's fine. Gavin, what would be your one absolutely must-have thing that would be in that political document?
Sure, I think, and I have lived in London I spent about 18 months there, so I know it fairly well and used to go there for various meetings on many occasions. But the one thing would be, I think it has to be diversity, as you're talking about one of the world's great mega cities, arguably one of the most successful in the world on that level. So you need to really tap into your different migrant groups and ethnicities and look at the USPs that they bring, and also on that point around the actual UK nations themselves. So I know, for example, for Wales, they're looking at some kind of London Welsh marketing or one banner, one Wales for all sort of Welsh oriented clubs in London, so they all play under the same kind of badges of One Wales, and they can help market Wales within the UK's capital. So yeah, inclusivity and diversity, tapping into that.
Thank you very much. And Simon, one last thought from you, please.
Thanks, James. I think the value of education, I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think the opportunity to bring sport as an educational tool and to align it with the SDG would really be the most valuable contribution. If I could make one, bullet point into that strategy document, is to take and the opportunities that education affords sport and sport affords education.
That's great. Thank you. Well, a final thank you from me to all of our panelists, to all of you for joining us early on day 4 of the London Sport Conference, and of course to Chris and colleagues at London Sport for inviting us too. I promised we would end on time, and we will. Thank you for bearing with the slight technical glitches that we've had this morning. I think we're all getting used to those in the new way of working. I would encourage you to jump over to the main stage now and to hear from colleagues both in London and Singapore and Stockholm as well. Thank you very much and have a good day.